Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, but there was no one there? It was just a question. A simple, harmless question meant to break the silence that had stretched far too long in the darkened lab. But somehow, it hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Dr. Ellie Harper, a seasoned physicist with a tendency to overthink, felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something wasn't right. But she had no reason to be afraid. It was just a question. Just a moment of doubt. Yet, when the lights flickered above her, it felt as though her own doubts were starting to breathe. Her hand hovered above the switch on the wall. The lights flickered again, more radically this time. She glanced over at her colleague, Dr. Adrian Price, who had been staring at the monitor for the last hour, absorbed in the data, oblivious to the unsettling atmosphere building in the room. "You sure about this?" Ellie asked, trying to push the feeling away. Adrian looked up, his eyes half-lidded, unbothered by the eerie silence that had settled in. "It's a controlled experiment, Ellie. Nothing we haven't done before." The hum of the machines surrounding them was the only sound, a constant reminder of the sterile, isolated nature of their work. The lab, a windowless room in the basement of their university, was supposed to be a place of order, logic, and reason. Yet, tonight, it felt like the air itself was thick with something else. The experiment was simple: manipulate the perception of light. They had built a device capable of bending light in ways that had never been tested before, experimenting with shadows, reflections, and refractions. But Ellie had felt, all evening, that they were on the edge of something far beyond their understanding. Something that the machine could not control. Ellie and Adrian had run the tests countless times, but there was something about tonight, something that felt off. With a deep breath, she flipped the switch, plunging the lab into darkness. For a brief moment, everything went still. The hum of the machinery died, leaving only the rhythmic sound of her breath. Then, a noise. A low scrape. Barely audible at first, but unmistakable. Like something, or someone, dragging their feet across the cold concrete floor. Ellie froze. She turned to Adrian, her eyes wide in the dim light of the emergency bulbs that had just flickered on, casting long shadows against the walls. "Did you hear that?" Her voice trembled, betraying her calm demeanor. Adrian didn't seem to hear it. Or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he muttered something about recalibrating the machine's sensitivity. But Ellie's attention was no longer on the experiment. The scraping sound was growing louder, clearer. And now, she could hear it more distinctly, a shuffle, then a drag, then another, closer now, as though someone, or something, was moving closer to her. Her heartbeat quickened. She swallowed hard. "Adrian," she whispered, "I think there's someone else here." His head snapped up, his face pale as the last of the light bulbs flickered out, plunging the room back into an oppressive, suffocating darkness. The scraping sound stopped, replaced by a sudden silence. It was worse. Because in that silence, something shifted. Something breathed. Ellie could feel it, pressing down on her chest, heavy and thick. Something was in the room with them. Something not quite right. Ellie, calm down. You're imagining things, Adrian said, but his voice trembled too. But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling. She reached for the light switch again, but before she could make contact, something moved behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her ears. There was nothing there. Just shadows. Shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally in the dim emergency light. A sudden gust of cold air brushed against her face, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something not human. Ellie, Adrian's voice was barely a whisper now, a threat of fear that had crept into his tone. We need to turn the lights back on. But before she could reach the switch, a low growl rumbled through the air, so deep it felt like it came from within the walls themselves. It reverberated in her bones, making her skin crawl. Something was not just in the room, but around them, surrounding them. Adrian took a step toward her, his movements jerky. The shadows seemed to close in, creeping closer, their forms stretching and distorting in ways that should not have been possible. The air felt thick, like the walls themselves were closing in. Ellie's mind raced. This isn't real. This can't be real, she thought. But her body betrayed her. Her pulse raced as the darkness pressed in further. Her vision blurred, and the shadows seemed to grow eyes. Watchful eyes. Eyes that followed her every movement. Then, she heard it. A voice. A whisper. Not in her ear, but in her mind. Leave now. Ellie's body tensed. She stumbled backward, slamming into the metal table behind her. We need to get out, she gasped, her breath shallow, ragged. Adrian stared at her with wide eyes, his expression pale with fear. But he didn't move. Adrian, please. Ellie reached for him, but before her fingers could touch his arm, a sudden burst of light, bright, blinding, flashed from the machine. The entire room seemed to hum with energy, the shadows writhing, distorting, and pulling at the edges of reality itself. Ellie could hear the sound of her own breath, ragged and uneven. The light flickered again, and in the brief moments of illumination, she saw it. A figure, half-formed in the shadows. A shape. A face. It was wrong. Before she could scream, the light went out again. Ellie's heart slammed against her ribcage. Her pulse was deafening in her ears as she staggered back, trying to make sense of what she had just seen or thought she had seen. The darkness enveloped her once again, thick and all-consuming. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she could feel her body shaking, betraying her attempts to remain composed. Adrian was standing motionless, his eyes wide with panic, but his body stiff, as if frozen by something unseen. The silence around them had become unbearable. Every creak of the floor, every shift of the air felt like it could be the precursor to something worse. What was that? She whispered, her voice shaking as she reached for Adrian's arm, hoping for some sort of grounding in the madness. Adrian blinked, his gaze still fixed on the shadows, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He didn't seem to hear her, or maybe he couldn't hear anything anymore. His lips moved, but the words that left them were nothing more than a breathless murmur. I don't know, he whispered, his voice cracked. I don't. The faintest shift in the air drew Ellie's attention. Something moved in the darkness. She wasn't imagining it this time, there was something in the room. She could feel it, brushing against the edges of her senses like cold fingers grazing her skin. She reached for the flashlight in her pocket, fumbling in the dark. The light flickered on weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and bend in impossible ways. Her eyes skimmed the room, her breath tight in her chest as she tried to focus on the walls, the floor, anything. But the shadows, they weren't right. They moved. They slithered. "Adrian," she called out, but her voice barely broke the air. The flashlight flickered again, casting eerie glows over the room. And then, footsteps. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. They were distinct, deliberate. The sound of someone, or something, walking toward them. The room felt smaller now, the shadows pressing in from all sides. The darkness had a presence, and it was closing in. Adrian finally seemed to snap back, his head turning slowly to face her. His eyes, wide with terror, met hers. "We need to get out, now," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. Ellie nodded quickly, her fingers trembling as she turned to the door. She reached for the handle, but it was locked. It couldn't be locked. They hadn't locked it. Panic surged up from her chest, suffocating her. Her hands scrambled against the door, pushing, pulling. It wouldn't budge. The shadows were closer now, pressing against her back. There was no escape. She spun around, desperation clawing at her throat. Adrian was standing behind her, his face pale, his mouth open in silent horror. He was staring at something, at the corner of the room. Ellie's gaze followed his, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The corner of the room, it wasn't empty anymore. There, just beyond the reach of her flashlight, stood something. No, someone. At first, it was just a silhouette. A human shape, but wrong in every way. It was tall, too tall, and its body seemed to flicker, to shimmer like a mirage. But the worst part? Its face, or what was left of it, was twisted. Its features were almost human, but stretched, distorted, like something trying to fit into a body that wasn't its own. Eyes, too many eyes, glistened from the shadow, watching, observing, waiting. Its skin, if it could even be called that, was pale, mottled, almost translucent, as though it were made of smoke rather than flesh. Ellie's breath hitched. She couldn't look away. The figure's mouth opened, a sound emerging from it that wasn't a scream or a whisper, but something in between. A long, drawn-out hiss that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. Adrian's voice cracked as he finally spoke. "It's not real. It can't be real." But the terror in his eyes told a different story. He was fighting himself, trying to convince his own mind that what they were seeing wasn't happening. Ellie's grip tightened on the flashlight, her knuckles white. "We have to leave. We have to." Before she could finish, the figure moved. It didn't walk, didn't run. It slithered, its limbs bending unnaturally as it dragged itself toward them, its twisted body folding and unfolding like a broken doll. The shadows around it thickened, swirling with an unnatural energy. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her mind racing for an escape, any escape. But the room had shifted again. The walls felt closer, the air thick with something else, something cold, something ancient. And as the figure drew closer, Ellie could feel it, pressing against her mind, dragging up the darkest corners of her thoughts. It was the darkness that had come alive. The shadows weren't just around them anymore, they were inside them, inside their minds. "No!" Ellie shouted, her voice breaking as she turned toward the door again. But the door was gone. The room had changed completely. The floor was no longer solid beneath her feet. It felt like she was standing on the edge of a void, the world around her swirling and stretching. Adrian was still frozen, his eyes wide, his body trembling. Ellie reached for him, but as her fingers brushed his arm, the air around them shifted violently. A sound, not a growl this time, but a whisper, seemed to come from everywhere. "It's too late. You can't escape." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The darkness had her now. It had both of them. The figure was inches away from Adrian now. It reached out with a long, pale hand, fingers like claws. And then, everything went black. The darkness was absolute. Ellie's mind screamed, but there was no sound. No breath. No heartbeat. Nothing but the suffocating blackness pressing in on her from every direction. She was falling. It didn't feel like the ground beneath her had vanished, more like the world had suddenly bent, twisted, and let her slip through its seams. The weight of fear, the heavy pressure in her chest, was worse than anything she had ever felt. Her limbs felt heavy, like she was moving underwater, but she couldn't tell if she was moving at all. Time had no meaning anymore. It felt like hours passed in mere seconds, or perhaps mere seconds had stretched into hours. But then, light. A faint, flickering glow, as though from a distant star. It was weak, fragile, but real. Ellie focused on it, her desperate mind grasping at the possibility of hope. She opened her eyes. The lab. The familiar cold metal walls, the scattered papers, the machines. But it wasn't the same. The shadows, still swirling in the corners of her vision, seemed to have grown. They weren't confined to the edges of the room anymore. They were alive, moving, stretching, writhing. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she realized she was standing in the center of the room, no longer pinned against the walls by the suffocating force of the shadows. But that did not bring her comfort. The shadows weren't just around her, they were inside her. "Adrian?" Her voice broke the silence, though it sounded foreign to her own ears, thin and distant. She called again, but there was no response. No sound at all except the low hum of the equipment and that same soft whisper, the same voice that had haunted her before. "It's too late. You can't escape." Ellie's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of a nearby table for support. Her mind raced, the images of the figure in the darkness flashing in her thoughts. The twisted thing that had dragged itself toward Adrian. Toward them both. She could still feel its presence, the coldness of it, creeping inside her mind. And then she heard it, something worse than the whispers. A scrape. A dragging sound. Ellie froze. No. She didn't need to turn around. She didn't need to see what was making that sound. She already knew. It was behind her, getting closer. Her fingers found a flashlight on the table, and she fumbled to turn it on, her heart pounding in her ears. The light flickered weakly, and for a moment, she thought she saw something moving in the corner of her vision. But then the light blinked out. It was gone. Panic surged up inside her as the darkness closed in again. The silence was broken only by that scraping sound, louder now, like claws against metal. Ellie didn't wait. She turned and bolted toward the door. It had to open. It had to. Her hand gripped the handle, but it was locked again. She could feel her breath quicken, the panic rising as she yanked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, it stayed shut. No. The sound was closer now. The scraping had turned into something worse, a low, guttural groan that felt like it came from the bowels of the earth. Something alive. Something monstrous. Ellie's mind screamed for her to wake up, to make sense of what was happening. but it didn't make sense. It couldn't. Please, Adrian. Where are you? She spun around, the empty room around her growing colder. The shadows didn't just cover the walls now, they stretched like fingers, reaching for her, closing in from every corner. And then Adrian's voice. Weak, hoarse, and full of terror. Ellie. She spun toward him. There, across the room, Adrian was standing. But he wasn't right. His body was stiff, rigid, as though he had been frozen in place. His eyes were wide and glassy, fixed on something Ellie couldn't see. And his face was pale, lifeless. The skin had a bluish tint, and there was a sickly, twisted smile on his lips. A smile that didn't belong to him. Ellie's heart dropped into her stomach as she took a step toward him. Adrian, she shouted. Adrian, please. He didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on something invisible, and his body didn't move. And then it moved. The shadow. The thing that had been lurking in the corners. It uncoiled itself from the floor like a serpent, rising slowly, its unnatural form stretching as it slithered toward Adrian. The edges of its body flickered and twisted, its outline wavering in and out of focus, like a broken reflection in a cracked mirror. Ellie's legs gave way beneath her as she backed away, her mind screaming. Her pulse was loud in her ears, but it was nothing compared to the growl that suddenly filled the room. A growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. The thing was real. Adrian's lips parted, and Ellie thought she saw something, the slightest hint of recognition in his eyes. But it was too late. The shadow reached out toward him, its long, twisted fingers brushing against his face, dragging its claws down his skin. And then Adrian screamed. It was a scream that shattered the silence. A scream that tore through the air, sharp and full of agony. Ellie's chest tightened as she turned to run. There was no time to think. No time to second guess. Her legs moved on their own, pushing her forward toward the far corner of the room. But the air was thick. The walls pressed in on her. The shadows followed her, always behind, always just a step too close. She reached for the door again, desperate now, her hands slick with sweat. But just as her fingers brushed the handle, the whisper. It's too late. You can't escape. The room began to shift. The shadows grew taller, thicker. The door was gone. And then, nothing. Ellie's world went black again. Ellie awoke with a sharp gasp, her lungs burning as if she had been holding her breath for an eternity. The cold air was thick and oppressive, clinging to her skin. She could barely open her eyes, her eyelids heavy, like the weight of sleep itself was trying to pull her back into oblivion. Her body was stiff, aching. Every muscle screamed in protest as she pushed herself up, her hands scraping against something rough, unfamiliar. She blinked. The light was dim, a soft, sickly yellow that barely cut through the shadows. The walls around her, metal, cold, bare, had an oppressive quality. It felt like the inside of a coffin. Ellie's throat tightened, and panic gripped her heart once again. Where am I? She forced herself to sit up, glancing around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. It wasn't the lab. It wasn't anywhere she recognized. The room was small, cramped, and the air was thick with something that made her want to gag. There was no sign of Adrian. No sign of the thing. The whispers, though, they hadn't gone away. They were still there, threading through her mind like a constant hum beneath her thoughts. It's too late. You can't escape. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, the words filling her ears. She clutched her head, trying to push the voice out, trying to regain some semblance of control. No. This isn't real. It can't be. Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her brow, but there was no denying the sense of dread in her chest. The room seemed to warp around her, bending and stretching like it was alive. The shadows weren't just things to be ignored anymore, they were sentient. They moved with purpose, pulling the light toward them like moths to a flame. But then, a sound. A soft shuffle. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the corners of the room. Nothing. But that shuffle, it was closer now. It wasn't her imagination. It was real. Adrian? Her voice faltered as she whispered his name into the silence. But there was no answer. She wasn't sure why she thought there would be. Adrian was gone. She had seen what had happened to him. The figure had taken him. The shadow had swallowed him whole. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still, somewhere near. The shuffle grew louder, closer. Ellie's breath came faster, her body tensing in anticipation. She had to move. She had to find a way out of this place. With a shaky breath, she stood. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she took a few tentative steps toward the only door she could see. It was a plain, rusted metal door, but it was her only chance. She reached for the handle, and the moment her fingers brushed it, the room around her seemed to tremble. No, not again. Her heart pounded. The shadows shifted, stretching toward her, as though they were alive, reaching out to pull her back into the darkness. But she didn't care. She didn't care about the shadows, the whispers, the sense of inevitability that pressed against her chest. She pushed the door open. Light. Real light. It was blinding at first, so bright it hurt her eyes. The outside world, wherever that was real. It felt like a dream, like she had just woken up from a nightmare. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw it, a narrow corridor, walls lined with sterile metal, much like the room she had just left. The air was cooler here, the hum of the lights overhead a bit too harsh. But it was a place. It was a way out. She took a step forward, then another. The shuffle behind her grew louder, more frantic. But Ellie didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Her thoughts raced, memories of the experiment flooding her mind. The light manipulation. The way the shadows had begun to twist and change. The way Adrian hadn't been himself. The way the thing had emerged from the darkness. Was it real? Was any of this real? Ellie's breathing grew heavier, but she forced herself to keep moving. The corridor stretched on in front of her, endless. The metal walls felt suffocating, pressing in on her. But with each step, she felt more certain that she was getting closer to something real. The shuffle stopped. She paused mid-step. Her entire body tensed, every muscle screaming in alert. It was too quiet. Too still. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. A feeling, the same one from before, crept up her spine. The sensation that she was being watched. That the shadows, the walls, the very air itself were waiting for something. And then, as if in answer to her thoughts, the lights above her flickered. Once. Twice. And then they went out completely. Ellie froze. She couldn't see a thing now. The only sound was the frantic beating of her heart, the rush of blood in her ears. Darkness. All-encompassing darkness. But then, faintly, as if from miles away, she heard something. A whisper. "It's too late." And then, the shuffle again. Louder this time. Closer. Ellie's legs gave way beneath her, and she fell to the cold, hard floor, her chest heating with panic. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And then, a touch. Cold. Ice-cold fingers brushing the back of her neck. Ellie screamed. But there was no sound. Only the whispers. Only the darkness. The shuffle was almost upon her now. And there, in the distance, she could hear the voice again. "It's too late. You can't escape." And Ellie understood. There was no escape. Not for her. Not for anyone. This place, it wasn't just a room. It wasn't just a lab. It was a trap. And they were all trapped inside. Ellie's pulse throbbed in her ears, drowning out everything else as she lay on the cold, unforgiving floor. The silence was deafening now, the absence of sound more overwhelming than the darkest depths of the night. The darkness seemed to breathe, alive and pressing on her from all sides, suffocating her, closing in as if it were sentient, waiting for her to break. Her mind raced, trying to find some thread of logic, something to cling to, something that could explain what was happening. But the harder she tried to make sense of it, the more the shadows shifted, stretched, like they were mocking her attempts to understand. She had to move. But her limbs refused to obey. Her entire body felt numb, as though the terror had drained all sensation from her. Her fingers twitched, reaching for something, anything. The cold metal floor beneath her seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like the heartbeat of the room itself. Move. Her mind screamed at her, but the fear was overwhelming, paralyzing her. What had happened to Adrian? What was that thing that had taken him? And where was she now? Had she really escaped? Or was this just another nightmare, another layer of her own madness folding in on itself? The shuffle. It was back. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't behind her. It was coming from all around her. The walls were alive, pulsating with something dark, something not of this world. And the whisper, the voice that had followed her since the first moment the lights had gone out, was louder now. It was no longer a distant hum. It was close, too close, like it was speaking directly into her mind. "It's too late. You can't escape." Ellie fought against the panic rising in her throat, the bile threatening to spill over. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't breathe in this suffocating blackness. It was like the world itself was closing around her, pulling her into its heart. She pushed herself up, her legs trembling beneath her weight. The walls around her were changing. They no longer looked like metal, but something darker, something alive. A low groan echoed through the room. No, not a room, she realized. It wasn't a place at all. It was a thing, an entity, a living, breathing force that was twisting and warping the very fabric of reality. This place was not meant to be. A sudden rush of nausea hit her. She fought it down, forcing herself to focus. She had to get out. She had to find a way to break free. Her hands found something solid, a door frame. Her fingers wrapped around it, and for the first time, she felt the faintest spark of hope. But before she could pull herself through, the door flickered. It was like the entire structure of the room had shifted, and the doorway seemed to melt, warping before her eyes. No! Ellie staggered backward. She wasn't in control anymore. She wasn't in control of her body. She wasn't in control of the world around her. The shadows were everywhere, swallowing the edges of her vision, distorting everything they touched. And then there was a sound. A voice, clear and strong. Not the whispers anymore. Not the distant scraping. A scream. A man's voice. Adrian. Her heart lurched in her chest. She didn't know how, but she knew it was him. His voice was filled with terror, desperation, as if he were calling to her, asking for help, asking her to do something, anything. The shadows rumbled, thrumming with energy as the air grew colder. Ellie had to make a choice. She had to choose whether to continue running, to search for an escape, or to face whatever had happened to Adrian, whatever it had become in the darkness. Without thinking, she pushed forward, following the sound of his voice. She stumbled down the warped hallway, each step more difficult than the last. The walls closed in tighter, the shadows crawling along the floor like insects. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't leave him behind. Adrian! Her voice cracked as she screamed into the oppressive silence, but it was swallowed by the darkness around her. Then, she saw it. A figure. Standing at the end of the hall. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step closer, her heart hammering in her chest. It was Adrian, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. But something was wrong. So very wrong. His head turned toward her, but his eyes were empty. Hollow. Like he wasn't there at all. The darkness had consumed him, had taken his soul, and left only a shell. No. Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. The figure of Adrian, what was left of him, moved toward her slowly. It was not him anymore. Not the Adrian she had known. It was something, twisted. Something born of the darkness. A puppet, controlled by the shadows. A scream tore from his throat. But it was not his voice. It was a sound of pure agony, a sound that shook the very foundation of the place. The shadows shifted, and Ellie could feel them pulling at her, trying to drag her toward him. She fought against it, struggling to keep her footing as the darkness seemed to wrap itself around her legs. Adrian, she cried out, reaching for him, but he was already moving away, stepping back into the shadows. The darkness shifted, rising up like a tidal wave, consuming him, consuming the very air around them. And then Ellie understood. There was no escape. She wasn't meant to escape. None of them were meant to escape. The room was alive. The shadows were alive. And she had been trapped from the very beginning. It wasn't the light that had been the key. It wasn't the experiment that had gone wrong. It was the darkness. And now, she was a part of it. It was 3 a.m. when the phone rang. At first, I thought I had imagined it. The house was silent, too silent, like the world had stopped. It had been a long day at work, and the weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on my eyelids. I was just drifting off, the kind of half-sleep where everything feels like a dream, when the shrill sound of the phone sliced through the stillness. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't answer immediately. Who calls at this hour? It was probably a wrong number, or some late-night telemarketer. I could hear the soft hum of my own breath, steady but shaken by the sound of that unexpected ring. It was so out of place in the dead of night, as if the phone itself had a mind of its own, forcing me to listen. I let it ring. But then, something in me shifted. I didn't know what it was, curiosity, or maybe just the creeping feeling that I couldn't ignore it. I reached for the phone and answered. Hello? Nothing. I waited, the silence thick and unsettling. I was about to hang up, thinking it was some glitch in the connection when the voice came through. I see you. It was soft, barely more than a whisper. The words sliced through the air like a blade, and I felt a chill settle in my bones. What? I stammered, heart racing. My pulse thudded in my temples. My mouth went dry. I see you, the voice repeated. It was a low, familiar voice that sent an uneasy shiver down my spine, though I couldn't place where I had heard it before. Right there, sitting on the couch, staring at your phone. Your hand is trembling, isn't it? I froze. My hand, still gripping the phone, trembled in the dark. There was no way this person could know that. I hadn't moved a muscle since I had picked up the phone. No one was supposed to know where I was, let alone be able to see me. Who is this? I demanded, my voice shaking despite my efforts to sound calm. I glanced around the room. The shadows seemed to loom closer, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. The dim light from the lamp in the corner of the room felt like it was dimming, like it couldn't quite fight the dark. You're alone, the voice continued, as though it could hear my every thought. Just you and me. And I know everything. What you've done, what you fear, and what you'll do next. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up, my body moving against my will. The room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. I'm not alone, I whispered, though I knew no one was there with me. Still, the words seemed to break the spell that had wrapped itself around me. I don't know who you are. What do you want? The line went dead silent, so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the electricity running through the walls. But then, after a pause that felt endless, the voice returned, softer this time, as if it were leaning in closer. I want you to listen, it said. Every step you take, every move you make, I'm here. Watching. Waiting. I'm always with you. A cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't the words that scared me, it was the way they felt real. As though this voice, this presence, was somehow in the room with me, right behind me. Stop. Stop it, I said, backing up toward the hallway. My skin prickled. My eyes darted nervously across the dark room. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was shifting, crawling closer with each second. But the voice didn't stop. I see you, it repeated, louder this time. Your every movement. Your every fear. You can't hide from me. The room seemed to close in around me, and for the first time, I truly believed those words. It wasn't just a phone call. It wasn't just a strange coincidence. Someone was watching me. And they knew everything. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking uncontrollably. My heart was hammering in my chest. I had to get out of there. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this made sense. I moved quickly, pulling on my slippers and heading toward the door. But then the phone rang again. A second time. A different number this time, but still unknown. I froze. I couldn't bring myself to answer it, but my hand reached for the phone like it had a mind of its own. Should I just ignore it? I thought about it. I thought about running out of the house, leaving it all behind. But that fear, kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if something in me knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. The phone rang again, and I answered it this time, without thinking. Hello? My voice was barely above a whisper, the fear still tight in my throat. I knew it was the same person. I didn't know how, but I just knew. Good, the voice purred. I was starting to worry you wouldn't pick up. You know, it's hard to have a conversation when you won't even listen to me. I backed away from the door, sinking into the nearest chair. My legs were trembling, and my hands were slick with sweat. My breath felt too fast, too shallow. This couldn't be happening. I don't want to talk to you, I said, trying to sound firm, but it came out weak, uncertain. Oh, but you do, the voice replied. You always do. You can't stop yourself. I know what you're thinking. Every thought, every fear, it's all here. All yours for me to hear. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands against them, but the image of the voice, the presence, lingering as if it were right there, just behind me. It was like I could feel it in the room, suffocating me. Stop it. I shouted, my voice cracking. Who are you? What do you want from me? The voice laughed softly, a low, eerie sound that sent shivers through me. I want nothing from you, really. I already have everything I need. Your every step, your every fear, it's all so deliciously easy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the room grew colder. I could swear the air itself was thickening, pressing against me, suffocating me. Every moment you take, every breath you make, you're just a puppet, the voice continued. And I'm pulling the strings. I tried to breathe, but it felt impossible. My chest tightened, my thoughts scattered. Was I losing my mind? Was this a dream? No, it wasn't. This felt too real. It felt too present. Then came a sound. A soft scraping noise from across the room. I snapped my head toward it, my eyes wide with panic. Nothing. Just the empty wall. But I could feel it. Something was moving there. Watching. What was that? I demanded, my voice shaking. The voice didn't respond right away, and for a moment there was nothing but my erratic breathing and that awful silence. I'm not here to hurt you, it finally said, its tone oddly gentle. I'm just here to remind you. Remind me of what? I was almost pleading now, desperate for answers, desperate for it to stop. Of what you're afraid of, it whispered. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone, the silence ringing louder in my ears than the voice ever had. My mind raced. What did it mean? Remind me of what? What was it going to do? I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The room felt like it was closing in, and I was trapped. It wasn't until I heard it, the distinct sound of a footstep, coming from the hallway outside my room, that I realized. The voice wasn't just in the phone. It was here. And it wasn't going away. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the quiet sounds of the house. The footstep, distinct, purposeful, came again. A slight creak of the floorboards outside my door, just enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I was paralyzed. The room, once familiar, now felt like a prison. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but the air in my lungs had turned to stone. My eyes were glued to the door, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't catch. Who was out there? Was it real? Or was I simply imagining it, the voice in the phone playing tricks on me? It was real. The thought slipped into my mind uninvited, and I couldn't push it away. Something was watching me. Something that had always been there, hiding in the corners of my life. The feeling of being observed, of being known, was overwhelming. Another step. Closer this time. I finally found the strength to move. My legs felt heavy, unsteady, but I stood up. Slowly. Cautiously. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out. But I had nowhere to go. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, grew darker. The light from the small lamp beside my bed flickered, casting strange shapes across the walls. For a moment, the room seemed to warp, the furniture elongating and distorting, like I was looking through warped glass. A sudden knock on the door. I froze. The world around me felt like it was spinning. Who's there? My voice was barely a whisper, even though every inch of me screamed to shout. I didn't want to know who was on the other side. I didn't want to face whatever it was. But the voice came again, low and calm, just like it had before. It wasn't from the phone. It was here. It was present. Don't be afraid, it cooed. I've been waiting for you. My blood ran cold. The air felt thick with something I couldn't describe. The walls closed in, the silence suffocating. There was nowhere to hide. Please, I whispered, barely able to form words. Who are you? The voice chuckled, soft and mocking. Does it really matter? I've been with you all along, haven't I? I shook my head. This was impossible. I was losing my mind. No one could know these things about me. No one could see what I saw. I stumbled backward toward the window, my hand shaking as I gripped the curtain. I had to see. I had to know. I pulled it back, my breath catching in my throat. Outside, the world was silent. No one was there. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I spun around, my eyes darting around the room, scanning every corner. The shadows were stretching now, crawling up the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed to mock me. A cold chill ran down my spine. Look at you, the voice whispered from the corner of the room, close enough that I could almost feel it brushing against me. You can run all you want, but you'll never escape. Not from me. Not from this. I clutched my chest, my heart racing as the walls seemed to pulse with the words. Stop. Please, stop, I begged. But it didn't stop. The shadows were everywhere now, whispering, moving, reaching toward me. The air was thick with their presence. With its presence. I'm inside your head now, the voice said. And I'm never leaving. I tried to breathe. In. Out. I needed to focus, to calm down. My hands gripped the windowsill, my nails digging into the wood. The shadows around me pressed in, suffocating, like something tangible was wrapping itself around me. I couldn't get away. I couldn't. The voice was everywhere. It was in the corners of the room, in the air, in my own thoughts. It laughed softly, a sound like the rustling of dry leaves. You thought you could hide from me. You thought you could run. I slammed my fist against the window, desperately trying to make sense of it all. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something. Why are you doing this? My voice cracked. What do you want from me? The silence was thick and heavy, but then, as if it had been waiting for the right moment, it spoke again. I want you to understand, it whispered. You're not in control anymore. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. The room felt smaller now. The walls were closing in, the shadows stretching even further, like they had a life of their own. I turned my head to the door. The knock from before echoed in my mind. The phone rang again. The same number. The same familiar, ominous tone. I didn't want to answer it. I couldn't. But I knew that if I didn't, I would never get the answers I needed. I grabbed the phone, my hand shaking so badly that it nearly slipped from my fingers. Hello? My voice was barely a whisper. The voice came through, calm, soothing. It's me again. I closed my eyes, tears stinging at the corners. Please, I begged. I don't understand. What do you want? You're mine now, it said softly, a hint of amusement lacing its words. I've been with you since the beginning. Watching. Listening. Every move, every thought, every fear. A sudden realization hit me like a slap to the face. The phone calls. They're not just about what I say. You're watching me. The words came out before I could stop them, and as soon as they left my mouth, I knew it was true. The voice chuckled, low and sinister. Oh, you finally figured it out. Took you long enough. I felt my knees go weak, my mind swirling. The shadows seemed to stretch, filling the room with their oppressive weight. I was trapped, suffocating in my own home, in my own mind. And that voice was everywhere. I'm going crazy, I muttered under my breath, the words barely audible. No, it said, almost pityingly. You're not crazy. You're just starting to realize the truth. The truth. The truth. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was I hallucinating? Was this all in my head? I looked around, my eyes wild, searching for any sign of normalcy. The room was unchanged, but the air felt thicker, like something was pressing against my chest. My vision blurred. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, or if I was losing my grip on reality. You can't hide, no matter where you go. I'm always there, the voice whispered. I always know. My breath caught in my throat. How? How can you know everything about me? Because I'm inside your head. I always have been. The voice was softer now, almost tender. You just didn't want to listen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But where could I go? There was no escape from this, no escape from it. The phone calls, the shadows, the voice, it was all a part of me now. It was inside me, in my mind, in my very soul. The ringing of the phone pierced my thoughts. The number. The same number, over and over. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't escape. Answer it, the voice urged. Answer it, and maybe you'll finally understand. The phone trembled in my hand. I had no choice. I pressed it to my ear, my breath ragged. Hello? I managed to croak. Silence. Then, the voice, louder this time, more menacing. I'm right behind you. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears, the blood rushing through my veins as if trying to escape from something far worse than the air pressing against me. Behind me? My voice trembled, barely a whisper. I didn't dare move, not yet. I was afraid that if I did, the darkness would swallow me whole. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was suffocating, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. I dared not breathe too deeply. I could feel the weight of the phone against my ear, still, the cold plastic a reminder that I was not alone. But the voice was still there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closer. "You're not real," I said, my words shaky. "This isn't happening. It can't be." The voice chuckled softly, as if it had heard this all before. "Denial is always the first step. But you'll see. You'll feel me soon enough." I forced myself to turn slowly, eyes scanning the dimly lit room. There, in the far corner, something shifted. A shadow. But it wasn't just a shadow, it was moving, creeping, twisting as though it had a mind of its own. My breath hitched, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. They were frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. A whisper, barely audible, drifted across the room. "Do you feel it?" That's me, always watching. Always waiting. It was everywhere now, the sensation of being watched, the sense that something unseen was closing in. The walls, once familiar, seemed to bend inward, growing tighter, more suffocating. My thoughts were jumbled, chaos swirling around my mind. I couldn't think. I couldn't make sense of anything anymore. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to force out, my throat dry. "Why me?" The voice sighed, almost as if bored with the question. "Why not you? Everyone has secrets. Everyone has fears. You just didn't realize how easy it was to get to you." I didn't understand. How could it know so much? My heart raced as fragments of memories, fears, and regrets flickered through my mind. Each one of them exposed, each one twisted into something far darker than I had ever remembered. And then I felt it. A breath. Cold. Behind me. It was just the slightest movement, but it sent my body into overdrive, adrenaline flooding my veins. I spun around, eyes wide, searching frantically. Nothing. Just the empty room, just the shadows playing tricks on me. But I knew it was there. The phone dropped from my hand, clattering against the floor. My legs gave way, and I sank to my knees, gasping for air. I could feel it, closer now, the weight of something pressing against me, a presence I couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of my being. And then, in a voice softer than ever, barely a breath, it whispered, "Look closer." I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face whatever it was. But something deep inside me, forced me to lift my gaze. And there it was. A figure. Pale, featureless, standing at the edge of the room. No face, no shape, just an outline that seemed to distort the space around it. Its presence was like an infection, spreading throughout the room, bending the very air. "You see me now," the voice said. "You see me, but you still don't understand." The thing didn't move. It didn't need to. It was already inside me, woven into my thoughts, my fears, my every move. It had been there from the start, controlling everything. I realized, too late, that it wasn't just watching me. It had always been a part of me. The calls, the whispers, the pressure, it was me, in a way. It was a part of my own darkness that I had never faced, never acknowledged. I reached out for the phone, but the world around me was spinning. The shadows seemed to swallow everything whole, and I felt the cold air close in around me, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. And just before the darkness took me completely, I heard one final thing. Goodbye. I woke up in a room I didn't recognize. It was the same, but different, like stepping into a dream that seemed all too real, yet nothing was quite as it should be. The bed felt too soft, the sheets too smooth. I could smell the faint scent of cleaning products, but there was something else, something stale in the air, like old wood left unattended for years. It was a hotel room, but not one I had stayed in before. I tried to shake off the odd feeling as I glanced at the clock on the bedside table. 7:30 a.m. The time felt oddly pressing, as if it were reminding me that I had somewhere to be, but I couldn't recall where that place was. I ran a hand through my hair, stood up, and looked around. The room was decorated in a neutral beige, standard hotel fare. A simple desk by the window, a painting on the wall that looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. My eyes wandered, searching for some clue. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to glimpse the faint reflection of the shower curtain in the mirror. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the only sound in the otherwise still morning. It felt as though I had been here before, but that wasn't possible, was it? I hadn't made any plans to stay in this part of the city, let alone in this hotel. I took a step toward the window, only to stop myself short. Something was wrong. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but my instinct screamed that I was not where I was supposed to be. The curtains drew back easily, and I expected to see a bustling street, cars moving, people walking to work. But instead, there was nothing. A vast, empty landscape stretching out for miles in every direction. The city that should have been outside was gone. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Still nothing. Just endless fields and a dark sky hanging low, threatening rain. Okay, this is strange, I muttered to myself. My heart raced, but I tried to remain calm. Maybe this was some sort of mix-up. I had been traveling a lot lately. Maybe I was just disoriented. I went to the door, turning the handle cautiously. It opened into a dimly lit hallway, just like any other hotel hallway. The carpet was a faded red, worn at the edges. No sounds, no voices. Only silence. My steps echoed as I walked down the hall, my footsteps too loud against the soft carpet. The elevator was at the far end. I approached it and pressed the button, waiting for the familiar ping. But it never came. Instead, a soft whirring sound filled the air, and the door slid open without a sound. I stepped inside, unsure of whether to feel relief or more unease. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator hummed and began to descend, but the strange sensation in my chest didn't dissipate. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby, I was met with nothing. Not a single person. Not clerk at the front desk, not a guest sipping coffee in the lounge. An empty lobby, as if everyone had just vanished. The silence was unnerving, and I felt my skin prickling with the sudden realization I wasn't just alone. I was isolated. There was no one else in this place, and that thought felt like an invisible hand gripping my throat. I looked around, instinctively searching for any sign of life. The front desk sat unattended, the bell on the counter untouched. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the walls, the quiet hum of the air conditioning the only sound. I felt a flicker of panic, a surge of confusion. Had I missed something? Was this a mistake? Maybe this was just some sort of weird dream. I pinched myself, hard, but the sharp pain told me I was awake. I walked to the large windows at the far end of the lobby, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain this emptiness. But what I saw only made things worse. Through the windows, the world outside was the same as the landscape I had seen from my room, wide open fields stretching endlessly into the horizon. No people, no cars, just the oppressive silence of an abandoned world. I took a step back from the window, trying to calm my breathing. I was just being paranoid. This was a strange hotel, and maybe the staff had stepped out for a moment. Everything would be fine, right? I walked back to the elevator and pressed the button to go up. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished metal. My face looked tired, my eyes a little too wide, as if I had seen something I shouldn't. When the elevator reached the second floor, I stepped out and turned down the hall. But as I walked toward my room, I realized something was off. The numbers on the doors were wrong. I knew I had checked into room 23, but now, as I looked at the doors, they were numbered in a completely different sequence. I stopped in front of the door that should have been mine. The number 25 stared back at me. This wasn't right. I knocked, despite my hesitation, and waited. No answer. I turned the handle and entered. The room was nearly identical to the one I had woken up in, right down to the faint smell in the air, the untouched bed. I walked to the window and looked outside. It was the same, an empty world stretched out before me. The same fields. The same low sky. I stepped back and closed the blinds. My chest tightened. Something was terribly wrong, and I didn't know how to fix it. I stood there, staring at the unfamiliar room, and slowly, painfully, I realized that I hadn't just traveled somewhere strange. I had stepped into something else. Something where time, space, and reality no longer worked the way they should. But I didn't know how to escape. I didn't even know if I could escape. And that thought, more than anything else, sent a cold chill running down my spine. The following morning, I woke up in the same room. Not the same as the one I had just tried to escape from, but the one from the night before, the one I was sure I had checked into. The bed felt cold under my back, the sheets tangled at my feet as though I had tossed and turned in my sleep. But I hadn't been sleeping. I hadn't been resting. I had been trying to make sense of everything, fighting the growing knot of panic in my chest. I sat up, the fog of exhaustion clouding my thoughts. The familiar smell of the hotel room, a mix of antiseptic and stale air, was no comfort. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something that could explain what had happened. But there was nothing. Just the same beige walls, the same soft light spilling through the window, the same strange quiet. I glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m. again. The same time as yesterday. I ran my fingers through my hair, pulling it as if somehow, if I just tugged hard enough, I could shake the confusion away. It didn't work. I didn't know how, but I had gone through this exact same routine already. The same room, the same moment. But something was off. The deeper I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just a room. I wasn't just waking up. I was reliving something. I tried to ignore the creeping panic, but it followed me as I got out of bed and headed for the door. The hallway was empty again, no footsteps, no murmurs, just the echo of my own unease. I took a deep breath and approached the elevator. It stood there, silent as always, waiting for me. I pressed the button, and the door slid open with that same unnerving smoothness. I stepped inside, heart pounding. The elevator moved, the sound of the cables stretching in the walls the only thing that kept me company. When the doors opened to the lobby, I felt it again. The dread, the loneliness, the suffocating silence that clung to the air. I wasn't going crazy. I was stuck. The lobby was the same as it had been before, empty, cold, and lifeless. I didn't even need to check the front desk. I knew it would be vacant. I knew the entire place was deserted. I forced my legs to carry me toward the exit, but my movements felt slow, heavy, like something was pulling at my soul, weighing me down. As I stepped outside, the air felt colder, thicker, and I could hear the distant howling of wind, but still, no signs of life. The world outside was nothing like the world I remembered. It was exactly the same. Fields stretching endlessly. Dark, oppressive clouds hanging low. No signs of civilization. No sign of life. I turned, my heart racing, trying to make sense of it. I had checked into this hotel, yes. But how had I ended up here? And why was it so familiar? Why did it feel like a place I had already been? I stood frozen, staring out at the barren landscape, my mind spinning. Had I been here before? Was I still dreaming? The wind shifted slightly, pulling my attention back toward the hotel entrance. It was then that I saw it. A figure. A shadow standing by the door, barely visible against the pale light filtering through the glass. It was blurry, like a smear of ink on the glass, but it was there. I blinked, and the shadow seemed to retreat. My heart stopped. I rushed back inside, my mind racing. The lobby was still empty, the air still silent, but the figure, it was gone. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, settled deep within me. I was trapped in a place I couldn't understand, where every room felt like a prison, and every hallway led me deeper into madness. I was afraid to sleep again, but I knew I had to. That night, the hotel didn't change. I woke up again in the same room. Again at 7:30 a.m. But this time, I didn't feel like I was alone. Something was with me. And as I stared at the walls, I could have sworn I saw something move in the corner of my eye. But when I looked, it was gone. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a hotel. This wasn't just a room. This was something else. Something that knew me. Something that was playing a game with my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was caught in an endless loop. Every time I woke up, it was the same. The same room. The same time. The same silence. But this time, there was something different. A shift in the air, an unfamiliar tension hanging over everything. I opened my eyes slowly, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, but the moment I became aware, the sense of dread settled in like a heavy weight. 7:30 a.m. again. I glanced at the clock beside the bed, but this time it didn't bring me any comfort. It was as though I was waking up in someone else's life, one that didn't belong to me. I ran my hand over my face, trying to force myself awake, but the world felt dreamlike, too soft, too unreal. And then, I saw it. In the reflection of the window, a fleeting shadow. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. Just the empty room staring back at me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My heart was hammering in my chest, a primal warning clawing at the back of my mind. Something was wrong. Something had changed, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I forced myself to move. Slowly, cautiously, as if each step might send me tumbling further into madness. The door. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I touched the handle. The familiar coolness of the metal did nothing to soothe the unease inside me. I opened the door, expecting the empty hallway, hoping for it, but when I looked down the corridor, I froze. There was a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was only a silhouette, shrouded in shadow, but it was there, unmoving, watching me. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to obey, rooted to the spot. The figure didn't make a sound. It didn't move. It was just there. I stepped back, heart racing, but then, in an instant, it was gone. I blinked, and the hallway was empty again. I took a shaky breath and pushed myself forward, ignoring the gnawing fear that crawled under my skin. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. I hurried toward the elevator, my footsteps loud in the otherwise silent hotel. The doors opened as they always did, silently, smoothly. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, the sudden sensation of movement made me feel sick, like the ground beneath me was slipping away. When the doors opened, I expected to find the lobby just as I had left it, deserted, oppressive, frozen in time. But when I stepped out, everything felt wrong. The room was too quiet, the air too still. The front desk was still empty, but now the space behind it had changed. The walls seemed to pulse with an unfamiliar energy, and the shadows in the corners stretched unnaturally long, as if the light in the room was being consumed by the darkness. I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes darting from one corner of the room to the other. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I walked past the front desk, toward the exit, but the moment I reached the doors, something stopped me. A low hum filled the air, like a voice whispering just beyond the threshold of hearing, too soft to make out the words, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I turned around, my pulse quickening, and looked back toward the center of the lobby. And that's when I saw it. A door that hadn't been there before. It was small, inconspicuous, tucked away at the far end of the lobby, behind a set of heavy curtains that had once been undisturbed. My heart skipped a beat. I had no memory of seeing it before, but there it was, as if it had always been there, waiting for me. I couldn't resist. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing in the empty room, each one louder than the last. The hum in the air grew, its pitch rising, but I was drawn to it, unable to look away. I reached for the handle and turned it. The door opened easily, without protest, revealing a small room bathed in soft, flickering light. Inside, I could barely make out the shape of something, or someone, sitting in the far corner. A figure. It was hunched over, its back to me. Its clothes were ragged, torn as if it had been waiting there for ages. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something dark and oppressive. The figure turned slowly, its face hidden in shadow. But I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The weight of its gaze pressed down on me like an unbearable force. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. And then it whispered. A voice, barely audible, but it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. Like it was inside my head. You've been here before. My heart stopped. I stumbled backward, my head spinning. The voice echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, until it felt like the very air was pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't respond. All I could do was run. I turned and bolted back down the hallway, my breath ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't look back. I couldn't stop. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. The hotel, once so familiar, had become something else entirely. A maze. A prison. I finally reached the elevator, my hand shaking as I pressed the button. When the doors opened, I stepped inside, but I didn't feel the relief I expected. Instead, there was only more silence. And a lingering question in my mind, what if I had never left? I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. You've been here before. The words echoed in my head, over and over, like a chant I couldn't escape. The elevator doors closed, but the sense of being trapped only deepened. It wasn't just the hotel that felt wrong, it was everything. My mind was unraveling. I didn't know where I was anymore, or if I even knew what home meant. The elevator hummed quietly as it ascended, but the air inside was thick with an unfamiliar tension. I stared at my reflection in the polished metal, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was only the dim glow of the lights above and the faint, distorted echo of my own breath. The elevator stopped abruptly. It wasn't a smooth halt, but a jarring, unnatural stop. My stomach lurched, and I stumbled forward. For a moment, everything was still, as if time itself had frozen. Then the doors slid open. I stared into the hallway beyond. It was unfamiliar. The walls were a dull, oppressive shade of gray, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. The atmosphere felt abandoned, forgotten. Yet, somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen it before. That it had always been there, waiting for me. I stepped out cautiously, my feet making a soft shuffling sound as I moved down the corridor. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was being weighed down by something unseen. The hum from the elevator faded behind me, replaced by an unsettling silence. I turned a corner, and my breath caught in my throat. At the end of the hall, the door to a room stood slightly ajar. It was the same room I had woken up in earlier, the same one I had tried to escape just hours ago. But it was different now, darker, colder, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I hesitated. The thought of going back inside made my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore the pull. Something inside me knew I had to face it. I walked toward the door, my legs trembling with each step. The moment I touched the handle, a strange chill ran up my spine, and a faint whisper drifted through the air. It wasn't a voice, just a sound, a low, unintelligible murmur, like the wind passing through the cracks in the walls. I pushed the door open. The room was unchanged. The bed was unmade, the windows slightly cracked, the same stale air lingering in the corners. But something felt off. The quiet was oppressive, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I stepped inside, but the moment the door clicked shut behind me, everything shifted. The walls seemed to close in, and the light flickered above, casting strange, twisted shadows across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. The air had grown thick, suffocating, and I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder, clearer, forming words that didn't make sense. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, yet nowhere at all. You can't leave. I whirled around, my pulse racing. The room was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something in the air, something intangible, but real. It was closing in on me, suffocating me with its presence. Suddenly, I noticed something. The reflection in the cracked window, it wasn't mine. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the face that stared back at me. It wasn't me. It was someone else, someone I didn't recognize, someone who had the same eyes, the same expression of fear, but it wasn't me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this place before whatever was happening to me consumed me entirely. I rushed to the door, but when I reached for the handle, my fingers brushed against cold metal. A chill ran through me. It wasn't the handle I remembered. It was different, twisted, warped. It was wrong. I tugged on the door with all my strength, but it didn't budge. The walls seemed to groan, as though the very building was alive, holding me in place. I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me, the walls closing in faster, suffocating me. "You're not leaving," the voice whispered, its tone sharp and harsh, like nails scraping against metal. "You never left." I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The pressure on my shoulder remained, like something or someone was standing right behind me. I jerked away, my mind racing. This wasn't real. None of this was real. I staggered toward the window, my hands shaking. I had to escape. I had to find a way out. The reflection in the glass was still there, staring back at me, but this time it was smiling. A twisted, mocking smile that didn't belong to me. I turned to face it. And then everything snapped. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. "You've been here before." The words echoed in my head, over and over, like a chant I couldn't escape. The elevator doors closed, but the sense of being trapped only deepened. It wasn't just the hotel that felt wrong, it was everything. My mind was unraveling. I didn't know where I was anymore, or if I even knew what home meant. The elevator hummed quietly as it ascended, but the air inside was thick with an unfamiliar tension. I stared at my reflection in the polished metal, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was only the dim glow of the lights above and the faint, distorted echo of my own breath. The elevator stopped abruptly. It wasn't a smooth halt, but a jarring, unnatural stop. My stomach lurched, and I stumbled forward. For a moment, everything was still, as if time itself had frozen. Then the doors slid open. I stared into the hallway beyond. It was unfamiliar. The walls were a dull, oppressive shade of gray, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. The atmosphere felt abandoned, forgotten. Yet, somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen it before. That it had always been there, waiting for me. I stepped out cautiously, my feet making a soft shuffling sound as I moved down the corridor. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was being weighed down by something unseen. The hum from the elevator faded behind me, replaced by an unsettling silence. I turned a corner, and my breath caught in my throat. At the end of the hall, the door to a room stood slightly ajar. It was the same room I had woken up in earlier, the same one I had tried to escape just hours ago. But it was different now, darker, colder, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I hesitated. The thought of going back inside made my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore the pull. Something inside me knew I had to face it. I walked toward the door, my legs trembling with each step. The moment I touched the handle, a strange chill ran up my spine, and a faint whisper drifted through the air. It wasn't a voice, just a sound, a low, unintelligible murmur, like the wind passing through the cracks in the walls. I pushed the door open. The room was unchanged. The bed was unmade, the windows slightly cracked, the same stale air lingering in the corners. but something felt off. The quiet was oppressive, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I stepped inside, but the moment the door clicked shut behind me, everything shifted. The walls seemed to close in, and the light flickered above, casting strange, twisted shadows across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. The air had grown thick, suffocating, and I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder, clearer, forming words that didn't make sense. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, yet nowhere at all. "You can't leave." I whirled around, my pulse racing. The room was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something in the air, something intangible, but real. It was closing in on me, suffocating me with its presence. Suddenly, I noticed something. The reflection in the cracked window, it wasn't mine. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the face that stared back at me. It wasn't me. It was someone else, someone I didn't recognize, someone who had the same eyes, the same expression of fear, but it wasn't me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this place before whatever was happening to me consumed me entirely. I rushed to the door, but when I reached for the handle, my fingers brushed against cold metal. A chill ran through me. It wasn't the handle I remembered. It was different, twisted, warped. It was wrong. I tugged on the door with all my strength, but it didn't budge. The walls seemed to groan, as though the very building was alive, holding me in place. I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me, the walls closing in faster, suffocating me. "You're not leaving," the voice whispered, its tone sharp and harsh, like nails scraping against metal. "You never left." I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The pressure on my shoulder remained, like something or someone was standing right behind me. I jerked away, my mind racing. This wasn't real. None of this was real. I staggered toward the window, my hands shaking. I had to escape. I had to find a way out. The reflection in the glass was still there, staring back at me, but this time it was smiling. A twisted, mocking smile that didn't belong to me. I turned to face it. And then everything snapped. The room shattered like glass, crumbling away into darkness. The floor beneath my feet gave way, and I fell into the void. I screamed, but no sound came out. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. Everything had melted into one continuous blur. The air was thick with the scent of something burning, something ancient and forgotten. My limbs felt heavy, like I was trapped in a dream, unable to move, unable to wake up. Suddenly, the world around me stilled. And then I saw it. The door. It was the same door that had been there before. The one I had tried to leave. But this time, it was open. And through the doorway, I could see another hallway. Another room. Another world. But was it real? I stepped toward the door, my legs heavy with reluctance. The world around me had lost all meaning, a sickening blur of memories and shadows. Everything felt distant, like I was watching it all unfold from the outside, as though my own mind had pulled away from reality, unwilling to accept what was happening. I didn't know if I could trust what I was seeing anymore. The door stood wide open, inviting me into another hallway, another room. But the question echoed in my mind, was it really another world? Or was it just a continuation of this nightmare? I reached for the handle, but the air around me shifted, becoming thick and stifling. The faint whispers from before returned, and I could swear I heard my name carried in the wind. It felt like the walls themselves were watching, breathing in time with my own shaky breaths. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. My skin prickled, and I shivered involuntarily, as if the very air was rejecting me, as though it knew I didn't belong. The hallway ahead was just as empty as the last, empty, but familiar. Everything was exactly as it had been before, down to the last detail. Yet, it felt wrong. It felt like the world was shifting, warping beneath my feet, bending to some unseen will. I walked cautiously, the echo of my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. As I passed the rooms, I caught glimpses through the cracks in the doors. But they weren't rooms. They were fragments, broken pieces of places I recognized. The street outside my childhood home, the park where I once played as a child, the abandoned alley behind the cafe where I used to meet friends. Each room was an odd reflection of some piece of my life, twisted and fractured. But there was no one there. Not a soul. Not a whisper of life. I reached the end of the hallway and turned. There was another door. But this one was different. Unlike the others, it was not ajar. It was sealed, its surface scarred, the wood warped as if something had tried to break through from the other side. It felt wrong. I stood before it for a moment, staring at the imperfections, my mind racing. Should I open it? Should I even dare? The whispers grew louder, insistent now. You don't belong here. The words were cold, cutting through the quiet like a blade. But my hand reached out anyway. The door creaked open with a groan, as though it had not been disturbed in years. The darkness beyond swallowed the light from the hallway, and I took a cautious step inside. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath was shallow. The silence was overwhelming, pressing against me, threatening to consume me whole. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I wasn't in another room at all. I was back in the hotel. But this time, it was different. This wasn't the hotel I remembered. It was distorted. The walls seemed to ripple, shifting in and out of focus like a dream struggling to hold its shape. The air tasted stale, suffocating. The scent of something burning lingered faintly. I took another step, and a strange pressure built in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I turned around quickly, but the door I had come through was gone. Only blank, featureless walls remained, stretching out into an endless void. I was trapped. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. My mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. The room, it felt like the hotel, but it was wrong. Everything was wrong. I was sure of it. The walls didn't belong. The hallway outside was a lie. The very fabric of this place had been twisted to trap me here, in this other world. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, in the corner, a figure stood. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, just outside of the light's reach. The shadows wrapped around it, obscuring its form. But I could feel it watching me, its presence suffocating. The whispers surged louder, urgent now. It's waiting for you. You can't escape. I wanted to scream, but no sound left my lips. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step toward the figure. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't. I was drawn to it, as if something inside me was pulling me forward. I stumbled closer, my feet dragging with the weight of my fear. The figure remained motionless, like a statue carved from the same shadows that surrounded it. But the closer I got, the more I could feel it, its gaze. It wasn't just watching me. It was waiting. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I stood a few feet away from it. The air between us felt charged, as if the very room was holding its breath. And then it moved. Its form twisted, bending in unnatural ways. Its body seemed to fold in on itself, stretching and contorting until it was no longer a figure. It became a shape, a shifting mass of shadows and whispers. The face was a blur, its features twisted and obscured by the darkness. It was everything and nothing all at once. I turned to run, but my legs betrayed me. I fell to the ground, the weight of my fear pulling me under. My hands scraped against the floor as I pushed myself backward, trying to escape, but the shadows seemed to cling to me. It's too late. The words echoed in my mind as the room closed in, the walls pressing down on me. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared into the void, my vision blurring. And then everything stopped. I opened my eyes, and I was back in the hallway. The hotel was normal again. The doors, the rooms, the dim lights hanging overhead, everything was exactly as it had been when I first arrived. But I knew it wasn't real. None of it was real. And now, I wasn't sure I could trust what was in front of me. What was real? What was I? And what was waiting for me on the other side? The house was too quiet. I wasn't used to it yet, and I don't think I ever would be. The silence felt heavier than it should, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. I had moved in not long ago, trying to start over after everything. It seemed like a good idea at the time, a fresh start in an old house, where the creaks of the wooden floors would drown out the sound of my thoughts. But now, as I stood in the dim hallway, I could hear my own breath too clearly, my footsteps too loud against the stillness. The house wasn't empty, not exactly. It was just empty in a way that made my skin crawl. I first noticed it 2 days ago when I passed the wall in the hallway near the kitchen. At first, I thought it was dust or maybe a trick of the light, but when I looked closer, I could see the faint marks, palm prints, not just one, but several, like someone had pressed their hands against the wall and dragged them down. I was certain they hadn't been there before. It didn't make sense. I hadn't been in that spot in days. And no one else lived here with me. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Just the house settling, maybe. An illusion. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found more prints, this time higher up on the wall, like someone had reached up to touch it. I stared at them, my heart pounding, trying to come up with an explanation. Was it a prank? Could the house have been visited by someone? But the house was isolated, far from the nearest neighbor, and the door had been locked. I paced back and forth, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the marks were there, too distinct, too deliberate. As if someone had been watching me. Waiting for me. It was when I started seeing more and more of them on the stairwell, near the bedroom door, along the hallways, that I started to lose sleep. They weren't just palm prints anymore. There were smudges, scratches, strange indentations in the wood, marks that didn't fit with the natural wear of the house. It felt like something was following me, something that knew exactly where I had been. The walls weren't just walls anymore. They were alive, watching me. One night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like a soft scratching, coming from the other side of the room. I held my breath, straining to hear it again. My eyes darted around the dark room, but nothing was there. I tried to dismiss it. Just the wind, I told myself. But then, I heard it again. Closer this time. A tap. A light scrape. Something moving on the wall. I sprang out of bed, my heart racing. There was nothing on the walls, no visible marks or scratches. But the sound, it was still there. It was coming from the corner. I walked over, hesitated for a moment, and then I saw it. A single fingerprint, fresh, smeared in the corner of the wall near the ceiling. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I backed away, my breath quickening. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. I went to the hallway. It was dark now, only the dim light from the kitchen casting shadows across the floor. My eyes darted to the walls. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. More marks. More prints. They were everywhere. The walls were covered with them, stretching up, down, across, as if someone had been walking along the surface of the walls, leaving a trail behind. I turned around. The air felt thicker now, the house pressing in on me. The silence was overwhelming. My mind was racing. I had to leave, had to get out of here. But as I moved toward the front door, I froze. There, in the hallway ahead, just past the kitchen, I saw it. A figure. It stood in the darkness, its shape faint but unmistakable. I could feel it, as if it were staring at me, waiting. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either, frozen in place like some twisted reflection in a dark mirror. I stepped back, and the floor creaked under my weight. The figure shifted, just slightly, but that movement was enough to send me running. I didn't care if it was real or not, I had to get out. I grabbed my coat, fumbling with the doorknob. But it wouldn't turn. I yanked at it, panic rising in my chest as I heard the sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable, from somewhere deep within the house. I was trapped. The marks were getting closer. They were following me, creeping along the walls, stretching across the rooms like tendrils, reaching for me. I turned, my mind spinning, and there it was again, just a shadow in the dark, moving. It was closer now, so close, and the marks on the walls, on the ceiling, they were following me. I ran, but the house was changing. The walls were moving, expanding, contracting. The very space around me seemed to shift as if the house was alive, trying to contain me, trap me inside its endless hallways. I reached the back door. The lock wouldn't budge. I pulled, yanked, but it was stuck. I felt something brush against my neck, cold, clammy fingers. I turned. And there, just in front of me, were the marks, fresh and deep, still wet, like someone had dragged their fingers across the door. Someone was here. I had to leave. But as I stood there, a thought crept into my mind. What if I was the one leaving the marks? What if the thing that was following me was me? The door finally gave way with a sudden creak, as if it had been holding its breath all this time. I burst through it, out into the cold night air. But as soon as I stepped outside, something felt wrong. The silence was almost suffocating, and the house loomed behind me, darker than it should have been. I turned back, my heart racing. The windows were dark, no lights, no movement, nothing. Yet, I felt as though I were being watched. I started walking, my footsteps quick and uneven on the gravel path. My mind was still reeling. What had happened inside? What was it that I had seen, heard, and felt? I kept asking myself, was it real? Was it all in my head? The marks, the figure, it didn't make sense. It couldn't have been real. Could it? I needed to clear my head, so I kept walking. The road stretched out before me, barren and empty. There were no cars, no lights, no sign of life. It felt like the whole world had been swallowed by the night. I tried to focus on the sound of my breathing, the rhythm of my steps, anything to distract me from the gnawing feeling that was creeping up on me again. But then, as I walked, I started to hear something. At first, it was faint, just a whisper of sound that might have been the wind or maybe my imagination. But then it grew clearer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and following me. I stopped. The sound stopped. I stood still, straining my ears. It was dead silent again. I continued walking, but now every step felt heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing there. No one. The sound of footsteps returned. Louder this time, almost too close for comfort. I broke into a run. My breath came in sharp gasps, but no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps kept pace with me. I dared not look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to keep going. I ran until my legs burned, until my chest ached, but the footsteps stayed right behind me. And then, when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I heard something else. A voice. Low, guttural, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. You can't escape. I froze. The words echoed in my mind, making my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. It was like the air had thickened around me, and I could barely move. I turned around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. No one. Just the empty road behind me, stretching off into the darkness. But then, I saw it. In the distance. A figure. Not a person, but a shadow. A shape. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it, like it was there, watching me, waiting. And it was coming closer. I ran again, but this time I didn't look back. The world blurred around me as I sprinted down the empty road, my mind spinning. What was happening? What was chasing me? Why couldn't I shake this feeling that something wasn't right? I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. It was a small place, barely a few houses and a small corner store. I didn't know where else to go, but I had to keep moving. I needed to get away from the house, from the marks, from whatever it was that was following me. But as I walked down the dimly lit street, something caught my eye. A figure. Standing in the distance, near the street lamp. A silhouette, watching me. I stopped. And the world felt still. Too still. I took a deep breath, mustering all the courage I had left, and began to walk toward it. As I got closer, I could see the shape more clearly. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something that could be described in any way that made sense. It was like a shadow, yet it moved, contorting, stretching, and bending in unnatural ways, like it was made of darkness itself. My heart raced. I stopped dead in my tracks. It spoke, its voice harsh, like the sound of nails scraping against a chalkboard. You were warned. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the very air thickening with every breath I took. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to escape. The shadow stepped forward. And then I heard it again, the faint sound of something scraping against the walls. The same sound I had heard in the house. The marks. They were back. I could feel the walls of reality crumbling around me. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me standing alone on the street, gasping for breath. But when I looked down, my hands, they were covered in the same marks. The marks on my hands weren't just stains or scratches. They were deeper, almost as though my skin had been branded, as though something had crawled under my flesh and left its mark there. I tried to rub them off, but they wouldn't fade. No matter how hard I scrubbed, they remained, faint and still fresh, like something had just happened. I stared at my hands for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to understand. How could this be possible? The cold air pressed against my skin, but I didn't feel it. All I could feel was the weight of those marks, the weight of that thing. The shadow, the voice. And the sound, always that scraping noise, like claws against stone. I could hear it now, as though it were following me, crawling under the skin of the world. I blinked, trying to clear the confusion from my mind. Get a hold of yourself. But every time I tried to focus, the marks on my hands seemed to shift, becoming more pronounced, as if they were moving, changing shape, almost alive. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, why it was happening to me. I could feel the panic rising again, but I forced myself to calm down. The last thing I needed was to lose control. I had to go back. The house. I turned and made my way back down the street, my footsteps echoing in the empty night. The street lamps flickered as I passed, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. It wasn't right. None of it was right. By the time I reached the house, my body was shaking. I stood there for a long moment, staring up at its dark, imposing silhouette. The windows were shut tight, and the door stood ajar, as though it were waiting for me. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding louder than the sound of my feet on the ground. The closer I got, the more I felt the pull. The house felt alive. It felt like it was breathing, like it was watching me. I stepped inside, my hand hovering over the doorframe. The air was thick, suffocating, like something was closing in around me. And then I heard it. The scrape. A sound so faint at first that I thought I might be imagining it, but then it grew louder, closer. The walls groaned as if the house itself were shifting, moving. I turned toward the hallway, where the sound was coming from. With each step I took, the scraping became more distinct. And then I saw it. The first mark, faintly visible on the wall, barely noticeable, just like the ones I had found earlier. But this time, it was different. The mark wasn't just a fingerprint. It looked like a handprint. But it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, the fingers too long, the palm too wide. It looked as though something had pressed its hand into the wall with unnatural force, as though it had melted into the surface. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Was this the same thing that had left the marks on me? I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to find out what was going on. There had to be an explanation. I moved further into the house, each room more oppressive than the last. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, the air growing thicker with each breath I took. And then, just as I reached the stairs, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the noise of movement began again, the scraping, but now it was coming from every direction, echoing off the walls like an army of claws dragging across stone. I turned, but the hallway seemed to stretch out in front of me, impossibly long, like the house itself was growing. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by something invisible, something holding me back. And then, from the far end of the hall, a figure appeared. Not a person, not something familiar. It was dark, just a silhouette, and it was moving toward me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes, locked on mine, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The scraping was louder now, all around me. The walls trembled. And then the figure spoke. You can't leave. You can't leave because you're already inside. The walls cracked open, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the stars. The sky, blue and endless, flickered before me. The house faded. The figure reached out and touched my hand once more. And then everything went black again. I woke up again, but this time the air was different. The silence felt deeper, heavier. It wasn't the suffocating quiet of the house. It was the kind of silence you get when something is missing, when you can feel the absence of sound crawling along your skin. For a long moment, I thought I might still be dreaming. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what was real. The marks on my hands were still there, faint but unmistakable, like a shadow clinging to my skin. But everything else had changed. I was no longer in the house. At least, not the house I remembered. The walls around me were covered in peeling wallpaper, the kind that looked like it had been there for decades. But the texture wasn't right. It felt soft, as if it could melt under my touch. I reached out cautiously, my fingers grazing the surface. It was cold. Cold and wet, like it was decaying, like it was alive. I could feel the floor beneath me, hard and uneven, like old stone, but there was a tremor in the air, a hum that pulsed with every breath I took. It wasn't just the house that had changed, the world around me had twisted, bent in on itself. The shadows in the corners seemed to watch me, waiting. I didn't dare look too closely. Someone was out there, somewhere just beyond my sight. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady. The marks on my hands burned again, like a brand searing through my skin. My heart raced as the feeling of being watched intensified. It was like the walls themselves were leaning in, pressing closer, and I was suffocating inside a space that didn't belong to me. Hello? My voice felt foreign in the silence, weak and desperate. My throat ached with the effort of speaking. No answer. I took a step forward. My foot caught on something soft and wet. I glanced down, my stomach lurching. The floor was covered in a thick, dark substance. It glistened under the dim light, moving in slow, rhythmic waves. It wasn't water. It was something else. I took another step, forcing myself to move despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The shadows shifted in the corners, twitching like something was moving just out of sight. I had to keep going. I had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint, creaking sound. Slow. Steady. Like a door opening, or someone, or something moving toward me. I turned. The figure was there. It had always been there. But now, it was different. It was clearer, more distinct, as though the fog surrounding it had lifted. Its face was pale, gaunt, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness, through me. But there was something about its form that didn't make sense. It wasn't human, not really. Its limbs were too long, too angular, its movements too fluid, like it was gliding through the air rather than walking. And those eyes seemed to know me, like they were reading my every thought, my every fear. They weren't just watching me, they were inside me, digging into my memories, into my soul. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel it drawing closer, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every second of my terror. "You can't escape," it whispered. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but it sent a chill down my spine. "You never could." I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. It was like the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand, holding me in place. The walls closed in around me, the darkness swallowing me whole. I tried to scream, but the air was thick, suffocating, and no sound came out. The figure reached out, its fingers elongated and claw-like, and I could feel its touch before it even made contact, cold and clammy, like death itself had brushed against my skin. "You're already part of this place," it said, its voice now a low, guttural rasp. "It's where you belong. It's where you've always belonged." The marks on my hands burned hotter, more intensely now, and I screamed as the pain shot through me, tearing through my flesh. But no one could hear me. No one was there. I closed my eyes, the darkness swallowing everything. And then it was gone. The figure. The house. The pain. I was left standing in the void, alone. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escaping it. It had always been there. And now, it was my reality. It started with a simple message. At first, I didn't think much of it. The message popped up on my phone while I was scrolling through the usual routine, checking emails, skimming social media. My thumb paused for a second while I saw the notification. "Where are you going?" I stared at it for a long moment. The message was simple enough, but something about it was off. I didn't recognize the number. It wasn't a contact I had saved, and I certainly hadn't been texting anyone recently. It didn't make sense. I shrugged it off as one of those strange, random texts you get from numbers you don't recognize, spam, maybe. But there was an odd feeling in the pit of my stomach, like something was tugging at me, something that wasn't right. I tapped the screen, preparing to ignore it, but before I could, another message appeared. "I see you." I froze. My mind raced. What the hell was this? How could someone I didn't know, be watching me? Was it a joke? A prank? I checked the number again. Still nothing familiar. Then, something else caught my eye. The timestamp. The message was sent only a few seconds ago. I hadn't even heard my phone vibrate. Had it been on silent? No. I would have noticed. The phone had been right next to me the whole time. I shook my head. It had to be a mistake, some glitch in the system. Maybe I had missed a notification earlier and my phone had just caught up. But as I was about to put the phone down, another message arrived. "You're not alone." I stood still for a moment. The room felt wrong. A strange chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly became aware of how quiet everything was. My apartment, usually filled with the dull hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of city life outside the window, now seemed almost suffocating in its silence. I glanced around the room. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, stretching unnaturally long across the walls. My breathing picked up, but I forced myself to calm down. It's just a prank, I told myself. It's just a glitch. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I quickly deleted the messages, trying to dismiss them from my mind, but my hand trembled as I did so. I tried to focus on something else. Work. A movie. Anything to distract myself. But the words kept echoing in my mind, growing louder as I tried to push them away. I see you. You're not alone. I couldn't help but wonder, how could someone possibly know where I was, what I was doing? The thought gnawed at me, and I found myself pacing back and forth in my apartment, my phone clenched tightly in my hand. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I wasn't sure anymore. I finally sat down on the couch, exhausted from the anxiety creeping up my spine. My eyes flicked back to my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen, almost involuntarily. The phone buzzed again. You are here, but you're not supposed to be. I felt my heart skip a beat. That was different. That was unsettling. I didn't recognize the number, but something about the message felt personal. Like it wasn't just sent to anyone. Like it was meant for me. Like it knew me, knew something about me that I hadn't told anyone. I felt a surge of panic, but I held myself together long enough to tap out a reply. Who is this? I waited, my breath shallow as I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. Nothing. No response. I frowned, staring at my phone as the seconds stretched on, but then, just as I was about to put it down again, another message appeared. You will find me soon. That was it. I didn't know why, but that simple line filled me with a sense of dread so intense I felt it physically. My skin tingled. My mouth went dry. I dropped the phone onto the coffee table and stood up, pacing the room again. It wasn't just the messages. It wasn't just the words. It was the feeling. The sensation that there was something behind all of it, something I couldn't see, but I could feel. I could feel it now, lurking in the silence, pressing in from every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision. The air felt thicker, heavier. I wasn't alone. And somehow, I knew. I knew this wasn't some random text or prank. It was something else. Something I wasn't ready for. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the words from the messages replayed in my mind, echoing in the stillness of my room. It was as though the words themselves were alive, circling around me, waiting for the next move. The next morning, I tried to push it all aside. It had to be some kind of mistake, a malfunction, or some weird, twisted joke. But as I got ready for the day, a cold knot of dread settled in my stomach. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The fear wasn't just in my head. It felt real. I turned on the news while I ate breakfast, the familiar hum of the TV filling the silence of the apartment. The announcer was droning on about the usual stories, politics, world events, local crime. But the words began to blur in my mind as I kept replaying the messages in my head. I see you. You're not alone. You are here, but you're not supposed to be. What did it all mean? Why me? Why now? I grabbed my phone again, hoping the messages would be gone. Maybe I had imagined it all. But when I unlocked the screen, I saw a new message waiting for me. I could feel my pulse quicken before I even read it. It's already begun. My hand shook as I stared at the words, and I felt a sickening realization settle deep inside me. It's already begun. What did that mean? What was going to happen? I looked around the apartment. Everything was the same. My couch, the kitchen counter, the television. But the silence felt different now, more oppressive. The light coming through the windows was too sharp, the shadows too deep. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the stress, that I was overthinking it. But the messages kept coming, and each one felt more personal. I know where you are. You're running out of time. The last message stung more than the others. It felt like a warning, like a countdown had already begun. My chest tightened. My phone suddenly felt heavier in my hand, as if it were pulling me deeper into whatever was happening. I wanted to throw it across the room to make it stop, but I couldn't. The curiosity, no, the need to understand, kept me tethered to it. I didn't even realize I had been staring at the screen for minutes until another message arrived. You will see me soon. I gripped the phone harder, almost hurting my hand. The panic was suffocating now. My thoughts were a blur of questions, none of which made sense. Who was this? Why were they sending these messages? What did they mean by soon? And what did they want from me? I knew I had to get out. I couldn't stay in this apartment, in this place that had become a prison. I grabbed my coat and keys, not even bothering to change. I just needed to get away from it, away from whatever was happening. The apartment felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me with its silence and the weight of the messages. But as I opened the door to leave, something stopped me. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was a feeling. Maybe it was a sound. A soft buzz, almost imperceptible. But when I looked down at my phone again, there was another message. I'm outside. I froze. The world seemed to go still. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I slowly turned, scanning the hallway behind me. It was empty. The door at the far end of the hallway was closed, the other apartment silent. I thought I heard something, a soft shuffle of feet, but when I looked, nothing was there. I stepped back, closing the door softly. My mind was racing now, the fear flooding in like an unrelenting tide. Was this a coincidence? Was I being watched? Or had I somehow, already crossed into something else? I didn't know what to believe anymore. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through the messages again, looking for something, anything, that might make sense. But all I could find were those chilling words. Each one a step forward into an unknown future, one I had no control over. It's too late for you. That one hit me hardest. It was like a final verdict, a confirmation that whatever was happening, whatever was coming, was inevitable. The phone buzzed again. The future is already written. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. How could it already be written? How could it be too late? I wanted to call someone, anyone. I needed to hear a voice, to remind myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But there was no one to call. No one who could help me. Whoever was sending these messages, whoever knew what was happening, was one step ahead of me. I looked out the window, feeling a strange, almost paranoid sense of being watched. The city below was quiet. Too quiet. And then, I saw it. A shadow moving in the alley across the street. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel it. It was as though something, or someone, was waiting. The phone buzzed once more. We're already here. I couldn't breathe. The shadow across the street lingered in my mind, refusing to leave. I didn't know if it was real or just my panicked imagination playing tricks on me. But the message, the final message, "we're already here," kept ringing in my head like a death sentence. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that this was just a series of weird coincidences. But nothing made sense anymore. Not the messages, not the feeling of being watched, not the way the city outside my window had turned from familiar to eerie in an instant. I turned away from the window, pacing the small apartment. My mind was spinning, but I couldn't make sense of it. Who were these people, or whatever they were? How could they know things before they happened? Why were they targeting me? I needed to figure this out. I needed to understand what was going on before I lost my mind. I grabbed the phone again, the familiar weight of it in my hand, both a comfort and a terror. Each buzz, each message, felt like another step deeper into something I couldn't escape from. I opened the messages, desperate to find something, anything, that would give me an answer. "You will make a choice soon." My heart skipped a beat. A choice? What did that mean? What choice? Was this leading up to something? I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I had to stop thinking like this. I had to stay rational. I was spiraling. The phone buzzed again. "Look behind you." I froze. My blood ran cold, and I didn't even need to glance over my shoulder to know what I would see. I didn't want to see it. But somehow, I couldn't help myself. My body moved as if on autopilot. I turned, slow and deliberate. Nothing. The room was empty. The window was still open, the faint city sounds trickling through the air. No shadow, no figures. Just the same four walls. I stood there for a long time, frozen. The phone buzzed once more. "We're getting closer." I backed away from the window, moving toward the kitchen counter, but I felt eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like someone, something, was watching me. No matter how much I wanted to tell myself it was all in my head, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. The buzz of the phone snapped me out of my thoughts. It's too late to run now. I felt the room closing in around me. The walls felt tighter, the air thicker. I was suffocating in this place. I had to get out. I had to do something before it was too late. I grabbed my jacket and my keys, not caring about the fact that I hadn't even taken a second to calm down or think things through. I just needed to leave. I needed to escape. But where could I go? I opened the door, stepping out into the hallway. My breath hitched as the air felt even colder than it had inside. The silence was deafening. There was no sound, no movement, just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I reached for my phone one more time, my hands trembling as I checked the screen. The message was there. "We're waiting." A cold shiver ran through me as I realized the truth. They were not just watching me anymore. They were in my world. They were part of it. The messages, the shadows, the feeling of being hunted, they were all connected. They weren't going to stop until whatever they wanted from me was done. The hallway stretched out before me, stretching endlessly into the unknown. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, as if from nowhere, a faint noise caught my ear. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. I spun around, my pulse racing. My apartment door was still open behind me, but there was no one there. The footsteps had come from behind me, not the door. I took another step forward, my legs shaky beneath me. The footsteps grew louder, and I realized I wasn't alone in the hallway anymore. I turned back to the door. The apartment was dark. It seemed as though nothing had changed. But there was something wrong. Something in the air, something invisible, but unmistakable. I felt like I had just stepped into a different reality, one where the rules of time and space didn't apply. And whatever I was walking into, whatever waited for me in the hall, it was only the beginning. The phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with one last message. You can't hide anymore. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. But the footsteps were getting closer. I ran. I didn't know how long I ran. My feet pounded against the cold concrete floor, my breath ragged in my throat. The footsteps, slow and methodical, followed me. They were closer now, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind me was getting nearer with every frantic step I took. I turned a corner, skidding on the slick floor. My heart raced, but it wasn't just fear. There was something else, a feeling like I was being pulled into something that I couldn't escape, no matter how fast I ran. I needed to stop. I needed to think. I stumbled into a small alley, pressing myself against the rough brick wall. I forced myself to steady my breath, my ears straining to listen. The footsteps had stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. For a moment, I felt relief. I wasn't being chased anymore. Then my phone buzzed again. You think you've escaped. You haven't. I froze. The words chilled me to my core. How did they know where I was? How was it possible that they were still watching me? I opened the message despite myself, as if some invisible force was urging me to do so. The screen glowed eerily in the dark alley. I expected another cryptic message, but this time it was a picture. A dark figure, its face obscured, standing at the entrance to the alley. I didn't remember taking it, and yet, there it was, as clear as day. I looked over my shoulder, but the alley was empty. No one was there. The sound of my pulse thudded in my ears. You've seen too much. It's time for you to understand. The message sent a wave of nausea through me. What did they want? What was happening? It was as though the world around me was slipping away, like I was no longer in control of anything. I looked down at the phone again, my eyes scanning the rest of the message. They've been watching you longer than you think. This has always been your future. I felt my knees buckle, and I slid down the wall, sitting in the grime of the alley. My mind was spinning, the message repeating in my head. They've been watching me longer than I thought. The thought sank deep into my bones. I had assumed these messages were recent, that this had started only when I noticed the strange messages. But what if it had been happening for a long time? What if all of it, the messages, the shadows, the sense of being watched, wasn't some isolated incident? What if it had all been leading to this moment, like I was a character in a story already written? I rubbed my eyes, the exhaustion threatening to overtake me. I couldn't keep running, but I couldn't stop either. The danger felt too real, too immediate. They were waiting for me to make a mistake. They were waiting for me to do something, anything. My thoughts turned back to the messages, to the prediction. This has always been your future. What did that even mean? Could the future be altered? If so, how? Suddenly, There was a shift in the air. The temperature seemed to drop. The alley felt colder, darker, and that oppressive stillness crept back in. A faint sound echoed from the end of the alley. Footsteps. The same slow, deliberate steps from before. I wasn't alone anymore. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling. I glanced up, trying to make sense of the shadows around me, but it was no use. There was no one there. And yet, the footsteps continued. Closer. I backed away, heart hammering, eyes darting to the darkness ahead. The figure. It was there. It had to be. The message, the footsteps, it was all leading to something. I wanted to run, but I felt paralyzed, as if something was holding me in place. A voice, soft, almost comforting, whispered in my ear, but the words were incomprehensible. I could feel its presence now, like a heavy weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I was running out of time. Then, the phone buzzed again. It's too late for you to change. We already have. And that's when I saw it. A shadow moved at the end of the alley, but it wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something not quite human, its edges flickering like a broken television signal. It was coming for me. The figure in the alleyway moved closer, its shape distorted, its outline flickering like an old TV set losing signal. I couldn't take my eyes off it, yet I couldn't fully comprehend what I was seeing. Was it real? Or was it a product of my fractured mind, twisted by the messages, the fear? The footsteps stopped. A breath caught in my throat. The figure was only a few feet away now. It didn't move in the way people did. It glided, a fluid motion that made no sense. 1 second, it was there. The next, it was closer. My heart raced faster than I could breathe. I had to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if some invisible force was holding me in place, tightening around my chest. I looked down at my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it. Another message blinked on the screen. It's too late. The future is already written. The words were like ice, sinking into my soul. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone, to wake up from this nightmare, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The figure raised its hand. Its fingers elongated unnaturally, like they were stretching, curling. A low, almost inaudible hum filled the air, growing louder. My eyes widened as the figure's face came into view, a face that was almost human, but with eyes that seemed to see through me into the depths of my mind. The voice that followed was cold, distant, yet somehow familiar. You don't understand, it said, its lips barely moving. This was never your choice. It's always been this way. You've always known. The words echoed in my head, reverberating with a strange certainty. I couldn't deny the growing dread settling in my chest. The phone, the messages, the footsteps, it all made sense now, but the realization only made it worse. I'm not real, I whispered, my voice cracking. The thought gripped me, cold and unyielding. Am I? The figure didn't respond directly. Instead, it stepped forward, and the phone buzzed again. You were never meant to escape. You were only meant to follow. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The tears were already streaming down my face, but they felt like someone else's. Like someone else was feeling all of this, trapped in a body they couldn't control. I wanted to break free. I wanted to scream. But I just stood there. The figure raised its hand again, and this time the air around us seemed to warp, the edges of reality bending. The phone buzzed once more, its light flashing. I glanced down, barely able to focus, but the message sent a wave of panic through me. It's over. You're already part of it. I choked on my breath, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The alley, the shadows, the figure, they were all blurring together, collapsing into a single moment of unrelenting fear. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice now filling the alley like a strange echo of my own thoughts. You've already seen the future. We're always here. Watching. Guiding. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the fog. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. The figure smiled, but the expression wasn't comforting. It was wrong. Wrong in every possible way. Its lips twisted unnaturally, and for a moment, I thought I saw another face hidden beneath it. One that looked like mine. A twisted version of me. It's too late, it said, its voice now a whisper, a cold breath against my ear. We've already written your story. Before I could react, everything around me shifted. The alley blurred, the sounds twisted into static, and the cold grasp of panic tightened in my chest. I felt myself falling, as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. And then, nothing. I woke up. There is a moment when silence becomes something more than the absence of sound. It becomes a presence, pressing against you, suffocating you from within. That moment arrived for me and my friends when we decided to take a hike in the forest. We were a group of 5, Jack, Emma, Liam, Rachel, and myself, on a weekend escape from the noise of our lives. The forest was deep, a sprawling labyrinth of trees and undergrowth that stretched for miles. It was the kind of place you could lose yourself in, far from the distractions of technology and city life. At first, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, the distant chirp of birds a comforting soundtrack to our steps. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dapple patterns on the forest floor. We were all in high spirits, chatting and laughing until something shifted. It was subtle at first. A quiet that shouldn't have been there. We noticed it after we stopped for a break. As we settled on the ground, something about the atmosphere changed. The wind that had been rustling the leaves had stilled, and the usual symphony of nature, birdsong, the rustling of animals through the underbrush, the distant hum of insects, was gone. I looked around. The forest was eerily still. Not a single sound. Does anyone else hear that? Liam asked, his voice quieter than usual. We all looked at him, confused. Hear what? Jack replied. The silence, Liam said, frowning. It's too quiet. We laughed it off at first, attributing it to the deepness of the woods. But the stillness lingered, thick and oppressive. There was no wind. No birds. No insects. Just a heavy silence that pressed against us, filling the air like a living thing. I glanced at Rachel. She seemed uneasy, her eyes scanning the trees as if expecting something to emerge from them. It's probably nothing, she said, though her voice didn't sound convinced. Just a weird moment. But the longer we sat there, the more I began to feel it too, the growing weight of the silence, the strange sense that something was wrong. It wasn't natural. The world around us, once alive with sound, had suddenly turned into a void. Jack stood up, stretching. Okay, enough of this. Let's get moving. We'll get to the clearing soon. We gathered our things and continued along the trail, but the silence followed us, thickening with every step. The trees seemed to close in around us, the path narrowing until it felt like we were walking through a tunnel. My ears ached from the lack of sound. We had been walking for hours, but something about the forest felt different now. The ground beneath our feet was soft, almost spongy, and the air had a strange heaviness to it. My heart began to beat a little faster, a nagging unease growing in the pit of my stomach. "Okay, now this is weird," Emma said, glancing over at me. "Do you guys feel that? It's like something's watching us." I nodded. I felt it too, the strange sensation that we were no longer alone, even though I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The trees were as still as ever, the shadows long and stretching across the path. It was hard to shake the feeling that the forest itself was watching us. Jack stopped in his tracks. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice sharp. I strained to listen, but there was nothing. No birds. No wind. Not even the usual sounds of distant animals. The only thing I could hear was my own breath, shallow and rapid. "Nothing," I said. "There's nothing to hear." But Jack looked at me, his face pale. "No. I swear I just heard something. Like footsteps. But we're the only ones here." Liam frowned. "Come on, man. It's just your mind playing tricks. The silence is messing with us." But the doubt was there now, creeping into my thoughts. The longer we stayed in the forest, the more unsettling it became. It was as though the trees were closing in, the air growing thicker with every passing second. The silence was no longer just a lack of sound. It was something more. It was heavy. It had weight. And it was pressing against us, inch by inch. And then it happened. A sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a rustle of leaves, a crack of twig breaking underfoot, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. We all froze, straining our ears. I heard it again. A soft, shuffling noise. "It's coming from over there," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We turned toward the sound, but there was nothing. Just trees. Shadows. And the oppressive silence, growing louder with every passing second. "Let's go," Jack said, his voice now tight with panic. "Let's go now." We started moving faster, our footsteps quickening, but the silence was suffocating. The rustling sound seemed to follow us, growing louder, closer. It was no longer just the sound of leaves. It sounded like footsteps. But no one was there. "Run!" I screamed, my voice breaking as I bolted down the path. We all sprinted, our hearts pounding in our chests, but the silence, it stayed. It surrounded us, pressed against us. The footsteps kept pace, always just behind us, but we could never see what was making them. We didn't stop until we reached the clearing. And even then, the silence didn't leave. It followed us, hovering in the air like a dark cloud. And then, for the first time, I realized it wasn't just the forest that had changed. We had changed too. The clearing was supposed to be a safe haven, a place where we could catch our breath and regroup. But as we stood there, gasping for air, the silence felt more oppressive than ever. It was as though the forest had swallowed all sound, leaving nothing but the weight of its presence behind. I tried to calm myself, to tell my mind that there was a rational explanation for everything. Maybe it was the isolation, the exhaustion. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just the silence. It was everything. Liam was the first to speak, his voice unsteady. Did anyone else hear it? The footsteps? Jack looked at him, his face pale. We're the only ones here, man. There's no one else. It was just the silence playing tricks on us. Rachel finished for him, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I wanted to agree with them, to convince myself that it was all just in our heads. But when I glanced around the clearing, my stomach dropped. The trees, tall and imposing, seemed to form a circle around us, their trunks close together, their branches interlocking like fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Emma shifted uneasily. We need to get out of here. We've been walking for hours. We should have reached the campsite by now. I nodded, trying to push the sense of dread away. The campsite wasn't far from the edge of the forest. A few more miles, and we'd be back to safety. I was sure of it. We'll go in the morning, Jack said, his voice firm. We'll stay here tonight, make a fire, and head out when the sun comes up. But as I looked at his face, I saw the doubt there, the fear he was trying to hide. And I felt it too. The longer we stayed, the stronger the feeling of being trapped grew. We set up camp in silence, the only sound the rustling of our tents and the crackling of a small fire we managed to start. The flames flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. The air was cold, the chill seeping into our bones, but it wasn't just the temperature that made me shiver. It was the unnatural stillness. There were no insects buzzing around the fire. No nocturnal animals moving through the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest had fallen asleep and forgotten to wake up. I tried to distract myself, to focus on the fire, on the familiar sound of the crackling wood. But every time I glanced at the trees, I felt that nagging sense of being watched. I wasn't alone out here. The others had settled into their tents, but I couldn't sleep. I lay wide awake, staring into the darkness, listening to every creak of the trees, every snap of a twig. The wind, which should have been whispering through the branches, was absent. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the oppressive silence, but it was no use. I kept hearing the footsteps, faint but distinct. I thought I could hear them just beyond the firelight, just out of sight. Soft, shuffling steps, as if someone, or something, was walking around the camp, circling us. I opened my eyes and sat up in my sleeping bag, trying to steady my breath. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking, and unzipped the tent. The cold air hit me immediately, sending a shiver down my spine. I shone the light around the campsite, but there was nothing. The forest stood still, as silent and unmoving as it had been all night. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I was just imagining things. I had to be. But the footsteps, they were real. I could hear them clearly now, unmistakable. A soft, steady rhythm, like someone walking through the forest just beyond the trees, just out of reach of the light. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was an animal, maybe another hiker, but I knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence rushed in to fill the void, almost deafening in its intensity. And then, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard a voice. Not from a person. Not from any of my friends. It was a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Come closer. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. There was nothing there. Just trees. Shadows. Silence. My breath caught in my throat. My legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. What was that? Who, no, what had said that? I backed away, stumbling toward the campfire, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to wake everyone up, but the words stuck in my throat. What if they heard it too? What if it wasn't just me? I glanced over at Rachel's tent. It was still. Emma's tent was equally quiet. Jack and Liam were asleep, their breathing steady. No one else had heard the voice. But I had. And I wasn't sure what was worse, the voice or the feeling that it knew I had heard it. I crawled back into my tent, my mind racing. I kept my flashlight close, shining it on the walls to keep myself grounded in reality. But even the light felt wrong, flickering as if it were trying to escape. I didn't sleep. Not at all. The footsteps never stopped. They circled our camp the entire night, slowly growing louder, closer. And as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't just a place. It was alive. The first light of dawn was weak, filtering through the trees in pale, thin beams. It didn't feel like morning. It felt like the forest was waking up with a purpose, stretching out its limbs, tightening its grip around us. My eyes were heavy, and my body felt like it had been dragged through the night, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I lay in my tent, staring up at the canvas, trying to convince myself that the night had just been a product of my tired mind. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The voice. The footsteps. The feeling of being watched. All of it felt too real, too tangible to be a figment of my imagination. I tried to ignore the voice in my head, the one telling me to get up, to wake the others. But my body was frozen, glued to the spot by an invisible weight. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence felt even worse. It was too quiet, like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and a faint breeze, but even that felt wrong. The forest didn't feel like a forest anymore. It felt like a trap. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to sit up. My limbs were stiff, my mind clouded by exhaustion, but I had to know if the others were all right. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The campsite was still. No one had moved. Jack's tent was the closest to me, and I could see his shadow through the fabric, the rise and fall of his chest as he breathed deeply in his sleep. I felt a slight sense of relief. At least I wasn't the only one who had made it through the night. I walked quietly over to Liam's tent, but before I could reach it, a movement caught my eye. A figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was barely a shadow, more like a distortion in the air, like a blur. My heart skipped a beat as I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I blinked, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, the after effects of sleep deprivation. But when I looked again, the figure was still there. And now, it was closer. I turned and hurried back to my tent, my heart pounding. I couldn't breathe. I could barely think. I yanked open the zipper of my tent and crawled inside, pressing my back against the fabric. My hands were shaking. I felt like I was suffocating in there, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Jack. Liam. Wake up. My voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. There was no answer. I tried again, louder this time, my panic rising. Jack. Liam. We need to go. Now. Still nothing. I scrambled out of the tent and ran to Liam's, yanking open the flap. His face was pale, his body still, but there was no sign of life. I shook him gently, my fingers trembling. Liam? I said, my voice cracking. Liam, wake up. Nothing. I backed away from the tent, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. I ran to Rachel's tent, but the same thing, her body was cold, unmoving. I could feel the panic clawing at my chest, squeezing my lungs tight. I turned to Emma's tent, and I didn't even need to check. I already knew. They were all gone. And then I heard it. The footsteps. But they weren't distant anymore. They were right behind me. They were all around me, closing in fast. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, and I saw them. The figures. Shadows in the shape of people, but they weren't human. Not completely. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like puppets on strings pulled by something unseen. They were circling me. No, they weren't just circling, they were pushing me, forcing me to the center of the clearing. And I couldn't stop moving. My legs wouldn't obey me. I felt as though the forest was pulling me along, dragging me toward its heart. I stumbled forward, my feet tangled in the underbrush, but I couldn't break free. The shadows were closing in, their presence heavy, suffocating. I didn't know what they were, but I knew they weren't friendly. One of them stepped closer, its form becoming more defined as it moved out of the shadows. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was pale and featureless, a blank, smooth surface that reflected the dim light in an almost unnatural way. Its eyes, if it even had eyes, were deep, black voids, absorbing everything in their path. It reached out, a long, spindly hand, and I felt a coldness in the air as it brushed against my skin. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the forest had claimed me, had taken control of my mind. Come closer, it whispered, its voice a rasping echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, but the moment the figure's hand touched my arm, everything went black. I woke up, but I didn't feel like I was awake. It was as though I had been pulled from one world into another, and the lines between them were blurred beyond recognition. My head was spinning, and I couldn't make sense of the shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. The cold air pressed against my skin, but it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real anymore. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. My legs were stiff, my arms aching as though I'd been held in place for hours or longer. The first thing I saw when my vision cleared was the forest. But it wasn't the same forest I had been walking through. It was darker, the trees taller, their bark a sickly gray, twisting in unnatural shapes. The air felt thick, as though it was alive, wrapping around me, suffocating me. There was no sky, just an endless canopy of branches, blocking out the light. I was lying on the ground, surrounded by leaves that looked like they were rotting, their edges curled and brittle. I sat up slowly, my head pounding, my breath shallow. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that I wasn't alone. There were others, standing in the shadows between the trees. They weren't my friends. No, these figures were different. Taller, more hunched, their bodies swaying gently as though they were listening for something in the air. The same dark voids for eyes stared at me, unblinking, cold. The figures didn't move closer, but I could feel them watching me, waiting. My pulse raced, a panic frenzy starting to build in my chest. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice breaking. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words didn't come out right. They felt muffled, distant. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I could feel its presence before it even got close, a cold pressure that seemed to draw the air from my lungs. It tilted its head, as if studying me. "You don't belong here," it rasped. Its voice was like the sound of dry leaves scraping against stone, hollow and chilling. I recoiled, unable to tear my eyes away from it. "What do you mean?" I managed to say, my throat tight. "Where am I?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it extended one long, gnarled hand toward me. Its fingers were twisted, impossibly long, ending in sharp, black nails that seemed to gleam in the dim light. I flinched, instinctively moving away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. "You're not the first," it whispered. "And you won't be the last." A chill ran through me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it meant. I wasn't the first to wander into this place. Others had been here before me, and they hadn't escaped. Why are you doing this?" I asked again, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure's lips parted, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. It didn't smile, but its expression seemed to shift, a strange satisfaction lingering in the empty voids where its eyes should have been. "We don't need a reason," it said. "You're here. And that is enough." The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the earth sinking, warping as though it were made of something soft, like flesh. I tried to move again, but it was impossible. Every step I took felt like I was walking through thick tar, unable to break free from whatever force held me in place. Panic set in. I had to get out. I had to run, but my body refused to listen. The figures stood there, unmoving, but the air around me felt like it was closing in, suffocating me, pressing me down. The figure's voice broke through the fog in my mind again. "This place will keep you forever. We always keep what comes to us." I felt my chest tighten as a sudden realization hit me. This wasn't just a dream or a hallucination. This was real. I was in some kind of nightmare, one that wasn't going to end. I looked at the figures, but they didn't seem to notice my struggle. They were still watching, waiting, like they had all the time in the world. Their patience was suffocating, as if my fear was the only thing they wanted. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the pressure around me lifted. I took a ragged breath, the air now clearer, fresher, like I had been underwater, and finally broke the surface. But the figures didn't disappear. They didn't fade into the shadows. They were still there, standing in the distance, watching. And I knew then that I wasn't going to escape. Not this time. I tried to move again, pushing my body to its limits. My legs buckled beneath me, but I forced myself to stand. The forest, or whatever it was still there, but now it was different. It wasn't just an empty space, it was alive, breathing, pulsing with something darker, something older. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, its outline blurred and shifting. It didn't belong to any of the others. It was something else. A presence, stronger, more powerful. It reached out with one hand, the long fingers trembling slightly, as if offering me something, or maybe pulling me in. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The figure's mouth opened, and it spoke, but the words it uttered were not words at all. It was a feeling, a sound that echoed deep in my chest, vibrating with an unnatural frequency. You belong to us now. The words hung in the air, vibrating with a dark energy that I could feel in the pit of my stomach. You belong to us now. The figure's hand stretched further, its long fingers now mere inches away from me. Its skin, or what passed for skin, was smooth and translucent, an eerie glow emanating from within. It felt as though everything around me had slowed, the space warping in slow motion, bending and stretching with each heartbeat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was like the forest had taken hold of my mind, dragging me into its suffocating grip. The trees loomed higher, their twisted forms seeming to lean in closer, narrowing my field of vision. The shadows began to pulse, like a living thing, responding to the figure's movements. The whispers returned, echoing in my mind, filling the air with unintelligible noise. It felt like they were inside my skull, scratching at the walls of my thoughts, drowning out any clarity. I backed away, trying to force my legs to move, but they wouldn't obey. I could feel the weight of the forest closing in, its branches creaking and groaning, as though the trees themselves were alive, watching. The figure's voice was softer now, but its words slithered into my ears, cold and deliberate. You wanted answers, didn't you? You wanted to know what happened to your friends. I flinched, a sickening realization creeping up my spine. The missing bodies, the strange behavior of the others, the way the forest had swallowed them whole. None of it had been random. This place was a trap. And I was the next prey. You've already met them, the figure continued, its smile widening, though its lips didn't move. They are here with us now. All of them. Just like you will be. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice stuck. It was as if the forest had stolen even my ability to fight back. I could feel it pressing in on me, the air becoming thick and oppressive, choking me with its unnatural presence. The figure moved closer, its body shimmering, blurring at the edges like an unfinished painting. It was neither fully there nor fully gone. It was a thing between worlds, not meant to exist in this reality. Join us, it whispered, its voice dripping with something far darker than mere malice. There's no escape. You've already entered the fold. Now, you must accept your place in it. A sharp pain shot through my chest, and I gasped, my hand instinctively reaching up to clutch at my heart. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and I heard the distant crackling of something breaking, trees snapping like dry twigs. But it wasn't the forest breaking. It was me. I was slipping away. My mind was unspooling, the edges of my thoughts disintegrating into static, becoming one with the whispers that filled the air. But even as my consciousness started to fracture, something inside me, something primal, fought to stay anchored. I couldn't let go. Not yet. I couldn't let it claim me like it had claimed the others. I managed to take a step back, and then another. The figure's gaze followed me, but there was no urgency in its movement. It knew. It knew I couldn't escape. You can't outrun what's already in you, it murmured, and I could feel its words burrowing deep into my mind, filling the cracks in my sanity. It's already begun. My breath was ragged now, every inhalation a struggle against the weight pressing down on me. But then, something snapped. I didn't know what it was. A burst of anger, a desperate will to survive, or perhaps it was the last vestige of my sanity fighting back. I didn't care. I ran. I didn't look back. The trees, the shadows, the figures, they were all just fading behind me. I pushed forward through the thick underbrush, ignoring the branches that scraped at my face, ignoring the stinging thorns that tore at my clothes. I had no idea where I was going. There was no path, no clear direction. Just the raw, animal instinct to escape. And then, just as quickly as the pressure had built, it was gone. The forest, which had felt so alive moments before, suddenly became still. The air was thinner. I could breathe again. My legs were still heavy, my body aching from the sprint, but I felt like I was breaking free. The ground beneath my feet felt solid, real again. But I couldn't stop. I stumbled forward, running faster now, until finally, through the trees, I saw it. The edge of the forest. There was a small clearing up ahead, and in the distance, the faint outline of a road. A distant hope that maybe, just maybe, I was getting out. I burst through the trees and collapsed onto the dirt path, gasping for breath. My heart was still pounding, but I could hear it now, my pulse steady in my ears. I had escaped. I had to have. I lay there for a moment, just catching my breath, feeling the weight lift off me as the forest fell away. But then, in the distance, I heard it again. The whispers. And they weren't in my head. They were behind me, coming from the trees. I turned, and for the first time, I saw them. The figures standing at the tree line, watching, waiting. And I knew then, there was no escape. Not from the forest. Not from them. They were a part of me now, and I was a part of them. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.